subject is all about the marriage and what role it actually plays. I wonder how many of you, when you saw the heading initially about the subject that we are going to be looking at being about the marriage, how many of you actually thought that the images of the marriage would actually play a role in understanding the book of Revelation? You know, the stories that we have recorded there. I think it's proper for me at this time to remind you that Ellen White wrote in the book Acts of Apostles, in the chapter on the Revelation, she writes there, in the Revelation, that means in the book Revelation, all the books of the Bible meet and end. Isn't that interesting? That if it was not for the book of Revelation, everything that has been written will kind of have no full stop in it. There wouldn't be an end. But the reason why we have all the books is to help us to understand what's happening in Revelation. And so today, this past week, has been the author's attempt to try and show us that there are images in the marriage that play a very important role. One of the things that he does say, and I want to start off with that, and that is that because of sin, the concept or the images that God tried to teach through the marriage, it has been tarnished. It has been, the spotlight has been moved away. The role that marriage plays nowadays almost seems irrelevant. The world doesn't consider marriage as that important. And the strange thing is that they go through the roles of marriage. You know, you'll see couples when they get together, they play house. You know, they stay together and they try and do what the marriage originally was designed to do, and that is to actually bring two people together. But what is the problem with marriage? Or not the problem with marriage, but with this new concept of marriage? What is the problem with it?
It lacks commitment.
Pardon? It lacks commitment?
So you just live together in the form of marriage, but not actually as God designed it to be.
Okay, it's, you know, they, as I said, trying to do it, but not according to the blueprint. What do we need to understand? You know, our attempt is to try and look at what Christ was trying to teach through the marriage ceremony. Now, the author again reminds us that in the book Genesis, we have the two institutions introduced. We have the institution of what? First, of the Sabbath. We have the Sabbath being commemorated in Genesis chapter 2, 1 verses 3 to 3. We have the Sabbath being introduced. But it's also interesting that just after the introduction of that, we have the marriage. We have the creation of Eve, and Eve being brought to Adam, and how that Adam says, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. The thought that I want to ask is, what is the Sabbath and the marriage really when it comes to God's plan with us? What is the marriage? Now, we've all been saying that people have an idea of what marriage is. We have the husband and wife coming together. Yes.
Pastor, I think God wants to be respect to us, the relationship God wants to have with us. So the marriage where the husband is one, he wants us to be one with God.
Okay, so that's correct. I think that if you look at what Genesis, and we had to read it, remember, I'm not going to get into the lesson like sometimes, yes, Trish?
Unity.
Well, the concept of unity, but I mean, don't you seem to see that when a couple get together, you know, they try and be together. I want you to look at something more, and that is that it's a covenant agreement.
For better or for worse.
It's an agreement between two parties. Do you understand? What is the agreement about? As you said, for better or for worse. But that's not really, you know, sometimes when it's worse, people don't want to be together. I mean, who thinks of a bad marriage as something that you want to stay in? I mean, we had to read about Hosea and the experience he had with the prostitute. We see something there that is quite interesting. We have a covenant agreement being established. But we find something about that agreement which is interesting. I'm talking about Hosea now. What do you find in the story of Hosea? It wasn't a good marriage. No, it was definitely not a good marriage. What was lacking? Commitment, yes.
When you say commitment,
Faithfulness.
commitment comes from two sides. Hosea was faithful, but his wife wasn't.
But that's correct. But what is it? Why do we have that story? What does it say? Even though you have a covenant agreement. Now, a covenant agreement is a contract drawn up between two people with the purpose of trying to establish grounds that allow the relationship to actually go forward. And usually, if one person is not honoring the grounds placed down, it becomes quite shaky. But what do we learn from the story of Hosea? And I'm going to bring it out into, even the one that we find. What is this? What is the interesting thing here? Yes. About this, we're looking at the story of Hosea now. What is the interesting thing?
From my understanding, as I was studying it, is that you see, like Brother Gerald said, Hosea was faithful, but the woman was not. And Hosea kept on following on her. Whenever she left, and then he would keep on following on her, like he was commanding. Just like, and so it's like us, when God keeps on following on us when we reject Him, but He never leaves nor forsake us. He keeps on following on us, regardless of our unfaithfulness to Him, but He remains faithful to us.
Well, you see, I like what you're saying, and that is that one of the partners remain honorable. Now, normally in natural circumstances, if one party has committed an unfaithful act, the other party feels that they have the right. Now, remember, there was a story which you had to read about where Jesus was talking about marriage with the Pharisees. Do you remember? And Jesus turns around and he talks about the original covenant agreement, but then they pick up Moses and they say, but Moses said something different. What did Moses do that we find has become the grounds for which we look at marriage? Yes.
Moses gave them the right to give the certificate of divorce.
He gave them the right to get divorced. And that was the intervention of man. Now, the thought that came up in my mind was did Moses all of a sudden stand and place something in place of what God had said? Why do we find this challenge? Moses says we can receive a letter of divorce, especially when one of the parties have committed adultery. What was Christ's response to that? When they brought it up, what was Christ's response to that? Why did Moses do it? Did you not read it? When they challenged Christ on the grounds of what Moses said?
I think that's when he said because of your hardness of your heart.
That's correct. It was because of the people and what they were desiring that he introduced that. Now let me explain as we go on. When we look at the marriage, we find ourselves looking at it in two ways. Well, this is what happens. you have the ideal situation. The ideal situation, especially if somebody's very tired, the ideal situation is what? What is the ideal situation for marriage?
Marriage for life.
I'm needing something more than that. I mean, if we've just been talking about, if it's a marriage where either spouse is messing around and carrying on, do you want to find yourself bound in that?
No.
So what would be the ideal circumstances for marriage? What is it that every woman wants in their marriage? They want love. Does love feed you?
They want money. They want money.
It's interesting. You see something that I'm aware of. Now remember, you also have to look at Ephesians chapter 5, where we find how that Christ is addressing his bride. Now what do we find about Christ that's so interesting? So what is the ideal situation? Where both parties understand the roles that they play within the marriage, and they honor their roles. Do you understand? That's the important factor. But so many times it's not about, the marriage is not about if I am fulfilling my role. Marriage nowadays is about, is my spouse fulfilling their role? Do you understand? Is he doing what he's supposed to do? And the moment your spouse doesn't do what you feel they should be doing, then you want out of the relationship.
That's controlling. That's why most men beat their wives. They want to control them.
In some sense, but what is then the ideal marriage?
Husbands to be submissive to their wives, and wives to be submissive to their husbands.
Husbands to be submissive to their wives.
I don't see that. I don't see that.
Man, that's interesting. To be Ephesians 5 says, wives, submit to your husbands, but then it doesn't say what? It doesn't just put full stop there. No, you've skipped a piece. What is woman's requirement according to the blueprint? Submit to your husbands as to the Lord. You know, there's one of the most interesting verses about Sarah. She refers to her husband as master. Now that is like, hey woman, but now listen, what has subtly happened? Men turn around and they start looking at their wives. Hey, are you listening? This is what you're supposed to do. Now, that's according to the way in which we look at the marriage nowadays. Hey, woman, when you listen to me, then you are, But you've just been talking about what the church. Now listen, it's very interesting that Paul addresses the woman, and he says to her, Paul says, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. Now, I want to show you just something as we go on. We need to really try and figure out, because what's the objective of the lesson study is to understand the images found there. Okay. And the image is that we have a husband and we have a wife. Do you understand? We have a role played by the wife and we have a role played. There are, sorry, I apologize. There are expectations for the woman and there are expectations for the man. Okay, so we have now the husband and wife being told what their roles are, what they should be doing. Now, in the case of Moses, when the people came to him, what was the problem in that particular case? You mentioned that the hardness of their hearts, but what made their hearts hard? Sin, without a doubt. I mean, if you read Matthew 24, it says, because sin abounds, the love of many grows cold. That means what happens is our hearts grow cold to the aspect of what's going on. So when we see your spouse, for example, not honoring their role, your heart to that, because that's as far as you're concerned is sin, your heart grows what? Cold towards that person. And I hear it frequently. I don't love my husband anymore. Or the wife says, that's what the wife said, and the husband says, my wife, I don't love her anymore. And then when you start looking into it as to what caused the problem, you'll find out that it's usually either spouse and sometimes both have not honored the agreement, but each are expecting their partners to honor their agreement, but they don't want to honor their side. Not if you don't do it. If you do your honoring, I will do my honoring. I will submit if you do your part. That's how we play it out. And we have a problem, and that is that the ideal is not like that. The reality. So what is Hosea teaching us that we need to understand? Hosea brings out a side of marriage that is not ideal.
Forgiveness.
It brings out a side where one of the parties is really, even though they go and they fetch them and they dress them and they help them and they forgive them, when he looks for her again, she's gone. That is not the ideal situation. But I'm going to ask you this question. Is it a reality?
Yes.
Listen to what's going on. There is the ideal, but then when you take away the rose-tinted glasses of marriage, which usually happens after maybe about 2 years, you all of a sudden see that your husband hasn't just got one good foot that he's putting forward all the time, he's got a bad foot that he puts forward also. So all of a sudden the ideal, the rose-tinted ideal fades away and reality hits you. Now in the story of Hosea, that's basically what has happened. Reality. Now I'm going to ask you the question. We're going to get to other aspects just now, but I want us just to focus on Hosea for a moment. Hosea has, in his experience in marriage, not the ideal situation. His wife is not submitting to him. It's not. He is, from his side, doing what every woman would want. He's lavishing on her everything. He goes and fetches her, he looks at it, he doesn't look at it, and almost from her side, the woman will say, wow, I would like to have a husband like that, where I can go and do what I want to, he keeps running after me. But that's not ideal. That's not real. In the sense that if you're trying to build it on what the blueprint is all about, you're living in a fool's paradise. Now I'm going to ask you this question. When God introduced the ideal situation, everything was right, wasn't it? There was no sin. But all of a sudden God finds himself in a situation where sin has crept in. And sin is simply this: when you don't honor the commitment between two parties. That is what sin is. God said to Adam and Eve, don't eat from the tree. They ate from the tree. Not ideal. But what was God's reaction to that? Did he want a divorce? Now let me just take you to the next part. We're going to look at something here. I want you to understand that we as God's people need to recognize that we're not living in the ideal world. We're not. We are living in a very realistic world where father will hate son and son will hate father, and there'll be war between one another, and there will be animosity, there will be quarreling. That's the real world. not the ideal that we sometimes look at. But God finds himself having introduced the ideal circumstances. Everything. I mean, where were the first couple placed? In Eden. Paradise. I mean, man didn't by the sweat of his brow have to work. There wasn't thorns. There wasn't all of this problem. They could spend moments together, not worrying about what they're going to eat or drink or about what they're going to wear. That was ideal. I have discovered that many times when I'm approached by couples that are fighting with one another, they call for the ideal to be in place. But we're not living in paradise anymore. What happened to Adam and Eve the moment they sinned? What happened to them?
They discovered they were naked.
Okay, they discovered they were naked. That is the part where our eyes are opened up and find out who we really are. But that's not the... Sorry, that's not the point I want to look at. Remember, we're looking at marriage for the purpose of understanding our relationship to God. What happens in paradise?
They hid from God.
Pardon?
They hid from
They hid from God. What happens as a result of that?
God came down to look for them.
God comes down. What is God doing that's so interesting? He's honoring his side of the agreement still. But then all of a sudden he finds out that they were hiding from him. He said, but why were you hiding from me? Oh, we saw it. And what has happened to the ideal relationship between God and his creation? It's broken. So God all of a sudden finds himself in the real world. And what's his reaction to that?
Give him a promise to help.
Well, he immediately implements that he's got a plan to restore the problem back to the ideal. But what does he know? And for 6,000 years, where have we been living? In the ideal or in true reality? I mean, I'm going to ask you this question. What do you think it was like for Adam and Eve when Cain killed his brother? We have no idea. We are accustomed to murder. We are accustomed to leaves falling off the tree. We look at it and say, grow up, you are in the real world now.
Well, it doesn't say.
It doesn't, but it does. There must have been incredible heartache. But the point that I'm trying to bring out here, they then long for what? The ideal. But what were they living in? The real. And so God has to do something. Now the interesting thing, up to that particular point, the relationship between husband and wife was what?
Ideal.
Was ideal. What is ideal?
Perfect.
No animosity, no blaming one another.
What do you, have you achieved ideal? I want you to imagine you've got scales. What is the ideal scales position? That's ideal. Isn't that true? That's ideal. In order for Adam and Eve to be in an ideal relationship, what do we need to see? That they're both equal. There isn't the head, there isn't the toe, there's equal. But all of a sudden, the circumstances change, and what happens? The scale becomes uneven. Now I'm going to ask you this question. We just read in Ephesians that women are to submit to their husbands as to the Lord. Okay, I don't want us to ignore that because that's a very important ruler or principle, but I don't want to get too involved in that. Why does God say that? I'm going to come to the husband now. But why does God say that? What happened in Eden? Who did the woman listen to? What did God have to do to try and get the scales balanced? He had to tell the woman, from now on, your desire will be for who? Your husband. He's actually saying, if you were doing that from the beginning, we wouldn't have the imbalanced scales. But in order to make them balanced, I have to introduce that particular regulation. So it's almost like he's saying to the woman, your power of choice has been taken away. And in order for you to be able to have ideal, you have to do this. Now ladies, I'm going to tell you something. In my counsel to women who live in a relationship with a husband is not Christian or doesn't attend church or anything, what I advise her is to be submissive to her husband as to the Lord. Now you might look and say, oh, chauvinistic man. But that's the only way that marriage will remain sound. The moment the wife starts saying to the husband, you're not doing what you're supposed to, you're not going to church, you should be the priest in the home and all that, you are never going to keep that marriage together. But then, you see, I want to come back to Hosea now. The interesting thing about Hosea is that we are so focused on the woman and what she's doing that we forget that Hosea was carrying out in an imperfect situation. He was honoring his side of the agreement. Now, any woman will finally, I think, come to her senses. But sometimes they don't. But I want to just go a little bit further. Here's God now. The ideal has been violated. The only way that he can get harmony back again is by introducing laws. Saying that if you obey them, there will be peace. Violate them, problems. Now, the interesting thing about the agreement, I want you just to tell me, there was another story which you had to look at, which was found in Ezekiel chapter 16. What's that story all about? It's kind of horrendous when you're looking at it. It's about a child who's been aborted. A child who's been basically taken and put in a dustbin and left for dead. Now, in some sense, that's what happened to us. Now, I'm going to ask you this. Who aborted us? Who aborted us?
God.
Hey? Not God. Who?
The devil.
The devil! Isn't that true? Why do you say the devil?
Because he's the one who influenced us to do wrong.
He's the one that promised us that we'd be like gods. The moment we found ourselves naked, what do we find he does? He leaves you in your mess. He doesn't come and try and solve your problem. He leaves you for dead. And this is something that we need to understand. When we consider God, He didn't leave us after we deserted Him for dead. In actual fact, what do we learn in Ephesians that God does that is so incredible? He loves His wife as His own flesh. He's willing to die for her. He does everything which is opposite to what really you would expect. The devil is not your friend, dear friends. When he achieves what he planned to do with you and he leaves you violating the rules, you are going to be left in a terrible mess, and he's not going to come to your rescue. And yet we find here, I see something about God that's so incredible. Was he still honorable to his creation? Was he still honorable to his covenant agreement? Yes, it doesn't change his heart. Now, what I want you to pick up about this marriage thing that's so interesting, that if one of the parties in a real world, that means when both parties should be selfish, when one of the parties decides to honor the agreement of marriage in thickness or in prosperity or adversity, sickness or health, when one of the parties takes it upon themselves to honor the covenant agreement, there is hope for oneness. Now, I've experienced this, yes.
I understand that this oneness and it's mainly focused on women being unfaithful to the husband. Well, because the women represent the church. But when you take in real life, when you come to real life, the people who are not faithful to their spouses are men.
Well, I like the way that you jumped to the word spouse. You didn't say the man.
Yeah.
Okay, but you as the lady, your spouse will be who? The man.
Yeah.
But the man, whose spouse will be what? The woman. Okay, I'm so glad that we should really be finger pointing here. You'll notice that it's not about if your spouse is doing what they do. It's about if you are doing what you're supposed to do, regardless of the circumstances. Now, it's true. The ideal situation will be where both parties are honoring the agreement. But I want us to go back to the story about this little baby who's lying in his blood, deserted by the mother, not caring. First of all, I want to ask you mothers, do you find yourself capable of doing that? Deserting your children? I want to tell you it's quite scary, yes.
Pastor, I wanted to hear the perspective of that lady. Do you mind if you can allow it to?
Okay, Lindy wants you to speak up more.
Yeah, because I think there's something that she wants us to be aware of, or there's an assumption that it's only men who does the unfaithful part. So if you can maybe finish your position, and then we can hear.
Okay, please, we are not here in debate as to try to decide what is real. I mean, what is ideal. Okay, I want to tell you something. Paul says, I would not have known what is right unless God told me what is right. Okay, now, I would like to have given the time, but I don't want to now because I know that her heart is the unfaithfulness of her husband or spouse. That is without a doubt. But I want to tell you, sometimes she has the right to say that. Because I want to tell you, husbands, some of us are really messing up. Terrible. We are. But I don't want to try and point out who's right and who's wrong here. I'm trying to come back to the fact that we are living in a world that is not ideal. You know, if you say to your daughter when you marry your husband, he's going to be faithful to you until you die, you're telling her a lie. Do you understand? That's not real. I mean, let's come back to the lesson study. We find the ideal given to us in the Garden of Eden. But the rest of the subjects that we're to look at, we find ourselves looking at after sinners entered. It's not the ideal. But it's how are we coping with living in the non-ideal. Now I'm going to ask you, what advice will you give people who are living in not the ideal? Now let's talk about marriage because that's what we're looking at. What advice will you give to your daughter or to your son when you know for a fact that the ideal is not going to be reality? What advice are you going to give your daughter or your son?
Sound advice.
What is advice? I think a lot of people say if you can remain single and not be sin, then remain single. It's the best way. We would never advocate marriage, especially if you come from a situation where your marriage situation is not ideal. You will not propagate. And that is why I find that the world that we are living in is actually following the rule of Moses. This situation is not ideal. Cheerio, I'm going to find somebody who will fit in with my ideal. And yet, that is not the blueprint. I want us to come back again. We have two stories on the other side of Eden. We have the story of Ezekiel chapter 16, where we find a baby having been deserted. Now, what is so amazing to me about that story, when you look at it, how did you feel about that in the moment that you heard about this little baby with still the blood of birth on it being thrown away? How did you feel? What was your reaction to that? You know what Solomon's reaction was? It's better for, he says life is better for the person who was born and dies and never experiences life. Solomon says that. Man, you were just saved from a horrible experience of living in the world we live in. I mean, I have friends who tell me they wish they were dead. Because that's the ideal situation. How many of you have wished you were dead? How many of you in your relationships wished you were dead? You see, we are living in a world where we are reaping the results of broken agreements. But God is not asking us from our side to break our agreement. He's asking us to honor it. And I mean, that's what we learn from the stories that we've been looking at. You know, the amazing thing is that God goes to, now, I wish we had more time. But if we really understood Ephesians chapter 5 and the story of Ezekiel 16 about this thing, I want to tell you there'll be a lot more ideal marriages in a realistic world. There would really be examples that you could turn people and say, that's what it should really be like. Because we see in the story of Ezekiel how that God doesn't look on, but he has pity. He goes and he takes the child, he feeds the child, he clothes the child, he does everything, and we get finally to the point that the child grows up in stature. She becomes beautiful because of his attention. Listen to that, his attention to her. That in the end, the desire of his heart is actually fulfilled in her. She becomes beautiful because of his handiwork. And I want to tell you, men, that if you really work well with your wives, they will become beautiful people. You know, the most amazing thing about this story is not about the harlot, not about the prostitute. It's about the groom. I want to tell you, we are listening to the heartbeat of Jesus Christ. We are looking at what He's going to do with you. He's going to make you so beautiful, and then He's going to present you to Himself. I mean, isn't that what most men want, you know? We want to make our wives so beautiful and we want them to be ours. I don't want to make my wife happy for somebody else. You know, I always read about, all the good men have been taken. No. You understand what I'm saying here? Women like, I wish I could have a husband like that one. No. Then you're becoming the prostitute here because you're going to have to take that man away from his woman. You know, that's what happens, isn't it? Terrible. What I want you to notice here, and I really want to emphasize this part. We're not looking at the bride here. What we do see about the bride is she's really dirty. What we do see about the bride is that she's not faithful. Now I'm going to take it beyond that. Immediately, when we look at it symbolically, who's the bride? Us! That is absolutely horrific to me. I mean, should we be walking around, in our white veils hanging over our faces, we're virgins? No, we're not, according to the word. We are harlots. Even though we're married to Christ, we are so unfaithful. And yet the groom is the one that is so incredible because he has not forgotten his first love. What I want us to see here is that God recognizes that the world he found himself in wasn't ideal. But in a world that was not ideal, he still remained the groom of ideal. Do you hear what I'm saying to you? That if you should find yourself in a situation which is not ideal, you should become the person that makes that situation ideal. And how do you do that? By honoring the covenant role that you are called to. In that moment, you become the person that takes a real situation and you almost make it unreal. That a husband can love his wife in such a manner as what Hosea was called to do. That's incredible. And the problem is, men, we don't do what Hosea did. And yet that's what we're called to do. And here I find that in the story that we're looking at, I want to tell you this. When you find somebody that is perfect, can you ever boast about your handiwork? No. Because that person's already perfect. But if you found something that was imperfect, like an imperfect gem, and you took time to bring out the perfection of it, can you now cook? And that is what God's going to do with each one of us. He's going to take the imperfect, and his handiwork is going to be revealed, that in the end she will be presented without spot or blemish, because he has washed her with his blood. And I look at this, and I want to say that we are living in a very real world, but we are called to live as if we are in paradise. So I'm saying to people in marriage, if you are not happily married, welcome to planet Earth. Okay? But if you really want to make it ideal, honor your side of the group. The beauty here is that when it comes to our relationship with Christ, he has never, not once, dishonored his role in our relationship. Never. And what I'm excited about is this, that one day this church, who is his bride, is going to be presented to him without spot or blemish. And it's not because of your handiwork, but because of his handiwork in you. I am looking forward to that. Where we will one day stand before God. I want you just to imagine this for a moment. We at the bride, it says, blessed are those who are what? Invited to the wedding feast of the Lamb. When I think about it, I want you just to imagine for a moment the ideal situation of a marriage. When you see that the husband stands in front. I don't know how other men felt about their marriage, but I remember standing in front, and also my wife came walking down, and I was like, wow, who's that? Found myself taken up in that moment. I've never found a bride not trying to make herself look pretty. They really go out of their way to make themselves look pretty. But Christ is going to do with us. Can you imagine the wedding feast of the Lamb? The bride comes. That's us. No spot or wrinkle. Come beautifully down. Can you imagine that relationship with that? Somebody tells me my time's up. There we go. So I'm hoping that as we look at the images from marriage, that we will still be in that fairy story mind, where we will know that one day we are going to ride off into the sunset. I don't know what the ideal horse will be, if it's a white one or a red one, but we are going to ride off into the sunset with our groom. And he's going to be that knight in shining armor. Don't you think so? Okay, let's close our eyes. Father in heaven, as we try to understand marriage, we recognize that we have fallen incredibly short of the agreement. But thank you that as we look at this, you have not. You have honored your role as groom. Help us to fall so much in love with you that we will allow you to work out your will in our lives. And we know that one day you will present us to yourself as that incredible bride. So please carry on doing your great work in us. For we ask this, dear Father, in your Son's name. Amen.